There's definitely a convergence there that Christians, I think, rightly see the danger in, but Christians have failed to see the opportunities. We need to think about what those opportunities are and how to exploit them. Secular people today are searching for a God that is proportionate to the dimensions of the universe that we've discovered.
Is the church going to survive by us building a spaceship and going somewhere else?
It can be easy to misread Teilhard as this naive optimist when really he is an alarmist about technology. He's an apocalyptic alarmist. The dangers posed by AI or other technologies that pose existential risks, all the more reason we need to be actively engaged, not just sit it out and expect everything to work out for the best.
We have Ian Huyett with us today, who is a constitutional lawyer, and he specializes in Christian advocacy. It's been published also in a number of publications for independent research, mainly specializing in Christianity topics. I know he also has a crypto topic, which we're surprisingly not going to be covering today. Instead, we're going to be talking about a interesting figure. Why don't you pronounce it for me, Ian?
Teilhard de Chardin. Now, I don't know how to speak French, but that's the customary English speaker pronunciation.
So we're going to be talking about Teilhard. He's I'm going to let Ian introduce him, but he is a Catholic priest who I think some of our Catholic audience should be familiar with him. Some of our Protestant audience, probably not. I know I was not familiar with him before reading some things that Ian wrote for Staseos. We'll link those in the description there for you guys to read. But it's going to be some interesting stuff regarding a lot of things that I think we talk about a lot on this podcast, including technology, futurism, and what Christians ought to be doing in this space as we look ahead towards a Christian future. So Ian, why don't you go ahead and give us just a little bit of a background of maybe what brought you to Teilhard and why you thought it was an interesting enough topic to write about?
Yeah, well, I wrote this series on Teilhard for Staseos, as you said. You might actually want to link to, I republished a kind of an updated version of it on my Substack, which is relatively new, and I created original AI-generated art by Midjourney of Teilhard, which was fun. Midjourney is much better at creating cool, kind of sci-fi-esque images of Teilhard than creating biblical art, which is the other main thing I've tried to do. But Teilhard, as you said, he was a Catholic priest and theologian, active in especially the early 20th century, died in, I believe, the 60s. He was a stretcher bearer in World War I, and he did a lot of his important theological writing in that period. One of his best collections of theological writing is a set of essays called Writings in a Time of War, and that war is World War I. After World War I, he also trained and worked as a paleontologist, and he participated in the discovery of Peking man in China. So very interested in human evolution and pre-human hominids and their evolution. And he was under the auspices of the Catholic Church participating in this paleontological research while also trying to kind of develop his profile as a theologian. The thing about Teilhard, though, that posed a lot of difficulties for him politically within the Catholic Church is he was doing all this writing before Vatican I, and the Catholic Church had not yet taken a clear position on human evolution. And there were actually, this was kind of news to me in studying Teilhard in his career. I had always assumed that the Catholic Church in modernity had always been very comfortable with evolution and that, young earth creationism was sort of a distinctly Protestant phenomenon. But there were elements of kind of young eartherism within the Catholic Church, evidently pre-Vatican I. And by young eartherism, I mean not just the idea that Christians ought to look askance at evolution, but the idea that you are beyond the bounds of sort of church teaching or what the Bible teaches if you believe that humans evolved from prior organisms. So because he was so fascinated by evolution, and in fact, evolution is really critical to his eschatology, to his theology, he makes it kind of the centerpiece of all of those things. There were some people that looked askance at him. And so his attempts to publish theological works were sort of continually thwarted by his superiors. He was a Jesuit. And so a lot of his most fruitful theological writing were essays that he circulated among his friends. And then many of them were published and became a lot more famous posthumously, even though he did have a circle during his own lifetime in which he was known and well regarded as a theologian.
Take a step back. You said you're changing the art out for Midjourney. I actually appreciated the Dali art in your original articles. I'm a big Dali fan, Salvador Dali. I know Matt.
Oh, it was Wombo Dream. The original series, I used Wombo Dream, but that was like a year or two ago, and I could just Wombo would not do people, and neither would Dolly really. It was just kind of these.
No. I'm saying Salvador Dali, the artist. You used some of his paintings.
That's so funny. I thought you meant Dolly. Yes, no, I used at the beginning of each Teilhard de Chardin piece for Staseos, pieces by Salvador Dali, the artist from Dali's nuclear mysticism period,
yes.
DALI, the Catholic painter who I love. I kept all of those at the end of my Substack pieces. I just moved them down. And another thing you might notice, Connor, is when I was giving instructions to Midjourney to make art of Teilhard, I would often tell it, do it in the style of Salvador Dali's nuclear mysticism period. And I think it did that pretty faithfully, actually. Dali was, of course, influenced by Teilhard, so it was appropriate to use Dali's nuclear mysticism, sort of Christian futurist art for a Teilhard series.
Yeah, I didn't actually realize those connections until I had read your articles. But yeah, definitely a big Dali fan.
I'm a huge Dali fan. I think there's such theological depth and insight in his nuclear mysticism, Christian period work. There's so much overlap between that and what we're talking about now. And so, Connor, I was super excited when I was listening to your Julian Alquist episode when you mentioned you were a fan of Teilhard's Catholic period.
Yeah, and you turned us on to Julian Alquist actually too, so we had to give you the thanks for that. That was a great episode.
What a great podcast! Yeah, I've never met him, but I subscribed to Gilbert Magazine, and I thought, Connor's got to interview this guy. So it was great to hear you guys get into more detail there.
So super interesting with this Teilhard character. I'll tell you, I'm a Protestant. I hadn't heard about him, but I do know that he's viewed as a very controversial figure. At least in Catholic circles. So you mentioned maybe some of the overlap with evolutionism and these things, but why don't you talk a little bit about maybe what makes him so controversial? And specifically, I'm kind of interested too, just looking at Christianity in general. I wrote a piece recently, a pretty short piece. I designed it kind of just as a Twitter thread and then adopted it to be somewhat of an article. But just noticing that there's a lot of pushback with Christians, specifically regarding AI. But I think there's generally this distrust of new technologies among Christian circles. And I think maybe Teilhard was experiencing some of that. Maybe there was some other things going on. But what is it that makes him so controversial?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an element of it, that he has very kind of optimistic, futurist embrace of technology dimension to his eschatology and his theology in general. But I would probably say at least among Catholics and probably Christians more generally, people who have a very peripheral awareness of Teilhard today, the main attack you'll hear against him is that he was a pantheist, that, he believed God is just kind of the totality of all the things that exist in the material universe. And maybe that creates some kind of super consciousness and we're sort of all a part of that. That we need to aspire to be absorbed into this single kind of monistic whole, and that's somehow kind of union with God. So that's the sort of common caricature of Teilhard, that he was a pantheist. He had these sort of quasi-Buddhist ideas, and I think if you hear Catholics attack him today, and if you hear them spell out specifically why they're attacking him, that's usually the attack, because post Vatican II. There are, of course, Catholics who believe that, humans didn't evolve from non-human organisms, although I think that's a minority position among Catholic thinkers. But you will not hear any Catholics say that you cannot be a good, faithful Catholic and believe in evolution and the scientific consensus on evolution. I think that's been basically ruled out authoritatively by the church. So that's not the line of attack you hear on Teilhard. What you instead hear is that he was a pantheist. And I will just say, just to sort of give a general overview of my kind of stance on Teilhard, as you said, he's my guy. I have an overall very positive view of Teilhard, but I definitely do also think he committed some serious errors. And I think he does need to be read with, a degree of caution, which is the formal position of the Catholic Church, of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That there are some, serious errors to be wary of in his work. But what I will say is that I don't think he ever affirmed any heresies. He was never outside the bounds of the cardinal doctrines of the Christian faith, and he certainly was not a pantheist. And in fact, not only was he not a pantheist, but one of the areas where reading Teilhard is very fruitful is he is an extremely penetrating and even brutal critic of pantheism. And I describe him in my series as kind of an apostle to the pantheist. He's trying to show pantheists why, yes, you have some good instincts, you appreciate the value of God's creation, but actually pantheism is a road to death. I mean, he's very, very negative in the language that he uses to describe the ultimate fruit of pantheism, even though he can write about pantheism with empathy. And that is really the thing that leads some people to incorrectly jump to the conclusion that he is himself a pantheist. Now, the last thing I'll say on that point is I think the vast majority of people who attack Teilhard as a pantheist have literally never read anything at all by Teilhard, like nothing. But I think, if you were to read a sentence or two of Teilhard out of context and come away thinking he was a pantheist, that's because he can write about it with empathy. But if you read Teilhard in his entirety, if you keep reading writings in time of war, he walks you down a road of, yes, I empathize, and here's why pantheism is a road to death. And you think that pantheism is a beautiful woman, but actually she's a corpse, and you've fallen in love with a corpse. He always terminates in a penetrating criticism of pantheism.
I have a lot of questions to ask you about this, and we're going to really unpack what Teilhard was essentially suggesting and kind of what we ought to take from it, in his body of works. But we are two Protestants talking about this Catholic priest. And I know Matt over here is actually a Catholic. And yes, I think this podcast tends to be pretty Catholic. Our last episode was with Matt Pinto, who is a Catholic founder of Ascension Press. So that was 3 Catholics and just little old me holding on the Protestant fort. So today we flipped it a little bit. We don't have Brandon, and we're definitely heavy on the Protestant side. So
but we're talking about a Catholic, so it's me and Teilhard against.
And Teilhard is here too, as well.
Right. Yeah. So I will say I was introduced to Teilhard before these articles a number of years ago, maybe 5 years ago. I studied science in college. Right. I have a master's in chemistry, my bachelor's physics and chemistry. So I, especially out of college, people knew me as having the science background, and I'm Catholic, so they were like, "Oh, you should read Teilhard. You might really like him." And it was interesting. I think I told you this before when we chatted. I was reading this book that somebody wrote about Teilhard, and some of the language that the author was using, I was like, I don't know if I really agree with that. But then anytime they quoted Teilhard, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like I can go with that. And it just in general, I think, is my experience with the Jesuits. Some people who really like the Jesuits, I disagree with, but every Jesuit I've met, I've agreed with. So the followers of, some of those people, they appeal to a different audience. Like you're saying, that he appeals to the pantheists. I think in general the Jesuits get that critique because they tried to, originally they were missionaries out in Asia, and so they would try to, meet the people where they were at. And then anyway, I think it's kind of a general thing about the Jesuits. I do think it's interesting. I've really had to wrestle with this science question. I actually, back in high school, I like that was the origin of doubts that I had was science. The doubts of religion that I had were from science. And so I've tended to hold the two in opposite hands, right? To say, okay, like science does these things and religion does these things, and they shouldn't intersect. And so I do think Teilhard is good to maybe have a Catholic approach to science. And so the book I was reading, and I just want to make sure this is correct. The author seemed to be painting this picture of Teilhard as approaching God through kind of finding immutable matter. Like he kept going deeper and deeper into saying, okay, yes, but this isn't permanent, and this isn't permanent, and this isn't permanent, and until reaching God. Is that maybe a correct theological?
Yeah, I think you might be thinking of Teilhard is pretty well known for his Mass on the World, which is a prayer in which he purports to, at least in a kind of poetic, metaphorical sense, use his authority as a priest to consecrate all of the world as a sacrifice to God. Evidently, that's not exactly canonically above board, but it is a beautiful piece of writing that a lot of people encounter Teilhard because of that piece of writing. There's a couple really interesting things there you said that I can engage with. One is I also originally encountered Teilhard indirectly. I learned of Teilhard years ago through Dan Simmons' science fiction novels. And Dan Simmons has this very rich sci-fi universe in the Hyperion series that's set in the distant future. There's a resurgent, very prominent Catholic Church in the future, and Teilhard has become a saint, and he's become kind of he's like the new Aquinas. He's become a central figure in Christian theology in Dan Simmons' universe. And I sort of had the impression from Dan Simmons, very vaguely, of Teilhard as this, early 20th century futurist who thought Christians are going to, go out and subdue all of the stars and planets of the universe and draw closer to God through that process. So just from encountering Teilhard indirectly, he sounded awesome, and I wanted to get to know more about him. So that was kind of my initial introduction to Teilhard. And then, you mentioned this ambiguity around the Jesuits. Teilhard, he's an ambiguous figure in how he codes when you read him. And that is part of what leads to his very sort of mixed reputation. So you can sort of read Teilhard as this kind of sort of Franciscan, hippie-ish, environmentalist, kind of old hippie liberal sort of theologian. You can read parts of Teilhard that way, and he can code as liberal, and he certainly is an environmentalist. No doubt about that. So that appeals to this kind of aging hippie following that he definitely has. But you can also read Teilhard as kind of a reactionary. He can code as reactionary depending on what sort of set of lenses you're using to read him. I mean, he has this very optimistic, active, militant eschatology where the church and Christians explicitly play this very active role as conquerors and are going to achieve, this tremendous worldly, political, cultural, and scientific success. He's unashamed in talking about complementarianism when it comes to gender and sexuality issues. And in fact, there is kind of amongst some segments of the left now, there's a move to sort of cancel Teilhard as a far right extremist of some kind. So, but at the same time, you can look at websites that are, Teilhard fan websites that are clearly run by these baby boomer hippies that love Teilhard and they like his mystical, poetic sort of environmental style of writing. So he has this tremendous ambiguity about him where you can read him as kind of one or the other. And that's part of what's created the sort of mixed legacy that he has.
As you're kind of placing him in history, right, early 20th century, I was thinking, I don't know if he's also Jesuit, but there was a Catholic priest who was an astronomer at that time, around that time, George Lemaitre. He was a Belgian.
Oh, yeah. Big Bang guy.
I'm him, right? But so he and so I'm trying to wrap my head around this, right? Teilhard people have a mixed view of him. I tend to see in my Catholic circles even people really like George Lemaitre, however you want to pronounce his last name. And anytime someone points to science and religion, they're like, oh no, we got this guy in our corner, and like they really boost him up as this public figure, right? He was the first guy. So for our audience, he initially proposed the Big Bang theory. He called it the primeval atom. And then it was, a few years later, gosh, why can't I not think of the other scientist's name who, there's another astronomer who actually made measurements that, corresponded with that. And then Hubble, the space telescope, Edwin Hubble then made measurements that, went along with the theory and kind of confirmed this, at least, as a theory. And so it's interesting. I wonder if you have a sense, or if you can point to why Teilhard Catholic embracing evolution is seen in, this controversial light, maybe this negative light, where like Catholic embracing the Big Bang, so many billion years before, right? Like the first step is not seen in this controversial light.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, my best guess is that there was the initial controversy around Teilhard was about evolution, and certainly the central place that Teilhard put evolution in terms of his overall theology. And the original 1960s censure of Teilhard from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is 100% vague. It says he committed serious errors, period. No attempt whatsoever to specify what those errors were. So, and now since then, I need to point out, he's been quoted in a bunch of encyclicals. He's been quoted by Ratzinger, by Paul VI, I'm pretty sure, by Francis, John Paul II. John Paul II's Cardinal Secretary of State released a statement, quote unquote, on behalf of the Holy Father, on behalf of John Paul II, saying that Teilhard was a man seized by Christ in the depths of his being. This was on the centenary of Teilhard's birth, and said that Teilhard offered this really unique path back to hope for people imprisoned by nihilism and despair. I mean, basically this ringing endorsement of Teilhard as a wonderful theologian, with this very slight qualification that, yes, his writing has some difficulties. That was John Paul II. So there have been a lot of positive statements about him that are official church statements or church teaching of some kind or the other. But there's this original vague condemnation that he committed serious errors. And I think originally the controversy was evolution. And I think what happened is that transmuted itself over time into this impression that he was a pantheist. And I will say, and I go into this in my series, in all fairness, Teilhard does write sentences in isolation that sound like he was a pantheist. Like, he talks about how wonderful unanimization is. He uses a lot of words like unity, unification, unanimization. He has a really infamous quote where people always quote one sentence and then they always omit the following few sentences. But the one sentence in isolation, he says, we will become a single vast grain of thought, which that sentence really sounds pantheist. I mean, even when I read that sentence, I was like, maybe this guy actually is a pantheist. And then I read the kind of following sentences, and he, in the surrounding context, is very explicit that we will not become a single undifferentiated being. Teilhard many times is very clear that he says, this is a direct quote, God cannot be in any way intermixed with the creation that he sustains in being. And then Teilhard, anytime he defines unanimization or unification, he is always explicit that we do not become a single monistic whole. It is like a marriage, where in a marriage, the husband and the wife are united in the marriage, but they are united in the fullness of their separate and distinct roles. And we will all, as the church, likewise be united as individuals, and like as parts of a body. Right. So he can speak in these very pantheistic sounding ways, and that contributes to the controversy. But anytime you then do a systematic study of what did he say in the following sentences or at the end of the essay, you find completely unfair to accuse him of being a pantheist. Other things I think he got wrong. And I go into in the series some things I think that, are important issues, not heresies, but important things he got wrong. But pantheism is not one of them. He was definitely not a pantheist.
Is it, and just to try to wrap my head around this more, and maybe there's two lines of thinking here. Is it that I guess one, and maybe this is a separate question, is evolution harder to accept than something like the Big Bang that's more cosmological? But then I guess I'm also thinking of, right, these two figures, right? You had at different points in history as well, right? You had Copernicus and Galileo. And is it that Teilhard is it him trying to unify the two, his science and religion, that then, or I right, like Galileo, the church didn't like him, not because they said his theory was wrong, or some of them, some part is, hey, you don't actually have proof for some of these things anyway. We can get really into it, right? But Copernicus, nobody looks negatively upon him, even historically, right? But then Galileo, you have, and maybe it was just a slightly different time in church history, or maybe it was that he tried to unite the two in a way that seemed disjointed. I don't know. Is that what's happening maybe with Lemaitre and Teilhard?
Yeah, well, I guess kind of my suggestion was I'm not sure how much today evolution still directly contributes, at least in Catholic circles, to the controversy around Teilhard. Although you have a better perspective on that, better and fuller perspective on that than I do. Certainly, my Catholic friends, when I talk to them about Teilhard, and if they have a sense that Teilhard, that guy was up to no good, I'm not sure about this Teilhard guy. Usually, when I scratch the surface there, I find they think he's a pantheist. That's really the problem. It's not that they're fired up about evolution. But I think that I agree with the kernel of the point you're making, which is evolution is seen very differently than the Big Bang in all kinds of Christian circles, not just Catholic. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that the discovery was framed. I think in part because Lemaitre discovered the Big Bang, it was framed as a victory for theism. Whereas evolution, I think, when major breakthroughs were happening in the development of Darwinian evolutionary theory, atheists were very, very triumphant in presenting it as a vindication of atheism. And rather than questioning that framing that the atheist used, a lot of Christians just wholeheartedly accepted the atheist framing and said, oh, well, you atheist scientists, you seem like very smart gentlemen. You say this is a vindication of atheism. So yes, sir, we accept your framing. We believe you. And therefore will wholesale reject this discovery and line of thinking. I think that's basically what happened.
Well, let's talk about the eschatology points a little more because, I know Teilhard's really known for this Omega point idea. And I think this is going to be really relevant to the podcast and what we're talking about because, so kind of our purpose here with this podcast, Ian, is we talk mainly to builders. So Christians who are building mainly in the crypto space, but a lot of AI builders as well. That's kind of the niche that we found. And we think it's really important to kind of, introduce these technologies to Christians in such a way that says, hey, we need to be building these things. And I think talking about the issues with evolution and whatnot, and frankly, I'm really not an evolutionist. I know you studied this a little bit in college. You're obviously a little more open to these types of things, but I do think
I studied biological anthropology.
Matt's a big scientist too, and we've had these discussions. But I think there's something. I think what really it is there's a lot of Christians who just see that a lot of technology and scientific progress and just progress in general doesn't really lead towards Christian ends, at least looking at the past 200 years and whatnot. And part of this does have to do with eschatology. I don't think everything has to do with eschatology. And actually on this tweet thread that I wrote, I spent a lot of time kind of making the case that, hey, we do need to be building AI things. And I know Christians distrust these things, but maybe here's a different perspective. And then I got totally ratioed by this other guy who came in and was like, oh yeah, this is all because of dispensationalism. I understand that argument. I do more or less agree with it, but I don't think that's like the whole thing. So I don't want to necessarily focus entirely on eschatology in this podcast, but I do think it's something interesting that we need to kind of introduce people to that says, hey, like, why are we building things? Like, what are we working towards? And specifically with Teilhard's Omega point, I think this kind of just unabashed, like full speed ahead attitude causes a lot of fears. So why don't you just introduce us to that, Ian, as far as the Omega point? What is Teilhard really suggesting, and how does this maybe differ from traditional concepts of Christian eschatology?
I'm not sure that there is any contradiction or necessarily difference between the Omega point and traditional categories of Christian eschatology. I think it's kind of a apples to pears comparison where you can sort of incorporate the Omega point as an additional insight into certain traditional Christian views of eschatology. So I don't think Teilhard thought he was offering a fundamentally new eschatology. That's basically what I'm getting at there. But the minimal definition, I would say, of the idea of the Omega point, which originates principally with Teilhard, and certainly he coins that term, omega point, is the idea that entropy and specifically the heat death of the universe will be resolved, and humanity will, in cooperation with God, resolve the heat death of the universe. And the omega point is any point in the future at which entropy and specifically the heat death of the universe has been somehow resolved in cooperation with God on Teilhard's theology. And then there are within that framework many different visions that different people have come up with, scientists who have been inspired by Teilhard and have tried to kind of create mathematical models of this, and then different subsets of groups of theologians who have different versions and conceptions of the omega point. But the rough framework for what an omega point is it's a future resolution of the heat death, and it's accomplished in part through human agency somehow. Our agency in cooperation with God. We are co-participants, co-creators with God in bringing this about. Now, I mean, you mentioned, these traditional Christian categories of, and I shouldn't even say traditional because, right, I mean, dispensationalism is a product of modernity. Even you could say that post-millennialism has roots that run throughout all of Christian history. But I mean, even these categories like post-mill, a-mill, pre-mill, these are all modern categories, even if some of the ideas they reflect are older. And Teilhard, one thing I should make clear is he does not offer a systematic biblical exegesis of eschatology. He quotes the Bible often, but you won't see Teilhard go through okay, I'm going to analyze the timeline in the latter third of Revelation and Christ returns posterior to the millennium. That's not Teilhard's primary area of interest. He's not doing a systematic kind of hermeneutical analysis of eschatology. And I think we should do that as the church collectively, but that was not Teilhard's interest. Teilhard, the way he applies the Bible to eschatology is basically through just sort of distilling a couple of themes. And the basic themes of Teilhard's biblical eschatology are, I guess you could say, two things. One, there's a dominion mandate. God has given us dominion over all of the works of his hands. And two, that dominion mandate is cosmic in scale. So God has created the whole of the universe for God's creation. And I think Teilhard then just kind of takes those two themes that he sees running throughout the Bible, and he just plays them out to develop this idea of the omega point.
Yeah, it's the question of okay, what are Christians working towards, essentially, right? And I think when Christians look at a lot of technology, I mean, you can just even say scientific thought in general. Speaking of Charles Darwin, you can believe that certain technological advancements have been good and will yield good results, but when you look at just the results of the past 200 years, we haven't necessarily see things strive towards a necessarily Christian future. So I think this is what causes Christians to feel, and you can say it's dispensationalism, right? Oh, we're scared of human progress because we see, human progress is ultimately going to lead to this future world that's obviously worse, right? Christianity is going to essentially maintain itself until the end of time, and then we'll just wipe out all the bad things, and then we can start again with basically a new earth.
Or rather, God will, as we sit by prayerfully and do nothing. I think that's really more so than any of the kind of terms that traditionally designate different eschatologies. I think the real divide is between these two big buckets in eschatology of, do you have this pietistic, quietistic eschatology where we sit by prayerfully and God acts. We're not agents. We're more like observers or the audience at a performance, right? Or are we co-participants with God? Are we agents that God has called to some mission or adventure? And God wants us to co-author and co-create something with him. And we need to do that actively. And we need to overcome adversity. And we need to discover things. And we need to explore new worlds, right? I think that's really the fundamental division. And Teilhard's omega point is just kind of a further iteration of that kind of second bucket.
it's a unique picture, I guess, of what that final moment's going to look like. It's an inspiring image at the very least, I would say.
It's interesting you mentioned Darwin, because Darwin was in middle age when the heat death of the universe was discovered in the 19th century. And pre-discovery of the heat death of the universe, and Teilhard wrote a lot about this, he was interested in kind of the intellectual history of this. You had this very optimistic atheism where there's this kind of robust atheist tradition of, not only is religion backwards and for fools, but we're going to create this wonderful, boundless future for humanity by kind of taking the place of God, and we're going to create our own destinies and so forth, and the sky's the limit once we discard sort of the shackles of religion. And Darwin himself originally kind of had that perspective, and then the heat death of the universe is discovered in the 19th century, that it looks like the universe is going to eradicate all life and just make any life in the universe impossible. And it looked like there was no escape from this. And Darwin and other people who confronted this, it pulled the rug out from underneath their entire worldview. Darwin was extremely depressed by the prospect of the heat death of the universe, understandably, and said it's just unbearable to contemplate this. And so Teilhard then enters into this conversation, and he says, Christian eschatology and this idea of the dominion mandate, and Romans saying that creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay or to corruption. Christianity and Christian eschatology, and specifically the active tradition in Christian eschatology, Teilhard says, really offers a very elegant answer to this heat death of the universe. And in fact, it offers the only answer. And that's basically where the Christian tradition of the Omega Point comes from, is Teilhard trying to apply these historic Christian insights about active eschatology to this new scientific discovery of the heat death of the universe in the 19th century.
I'm trying to balance, I guess, both viewpoints here. The one that says, yes, we need to embrace technological and scientific advancement. And the other side that says, okay, but the results of that over the past 200 years just hasn't lent towards Christianity. And I guess I use Charles Darwin as kind of that example. You would look at Charles Darwin, maybe not necessarily positively, but at the very least advancing that scientific endeavor. And we can see even today, we have a lot of figures who are pushing scientific advancements. Elon Musk, Sam Altman, even Vitalik here with crypto and Ethereum. But for the most part, it doesn't seem like these figures are Christians. It's mostly non-Christians that are working towards these advancements. And because of that, we haven't seen things necessarily promote Christianity or promote, good social morals or social values. There's just been a lot of history. So I don't think it's necessarily dispensationalism that is causing Christians to question whether or not we should progress. I think it really is just the past 200 years. And so I can't blame them for being distrustful or having maybe some qualms about just an open embrace of technology in the way Teilhard is.
The question, though, Connor, is how much of that disproportionate atheist or naturalist representation among these leading scientific figures, how much of that has to do with the premises of naturalism and atheism versus Christians opting out of their calling?
Yeah, I can see that. But I do also, I guess I see a type A and type B problem. It's one, Christians don't participate and we don't, build these things. And then we just, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We lose because we don't participate. But then you also see maybe a character like Teilhard, who is a Christian, who is kind of pushing these boundaries. But at the same time, what is he fueling? Well, like you just said, there's a lot of people who maybe don't fully understand what he's implying, but the people who have fully embraced him, even if they don't necessarily embrace his views on Christianity, of some of these secularists or transhumanists who are maybe using bits and pieces of his theology to basically support their causes. So Christians fear that we're just going to be adding, I guess, fuel to the fire in the sense.
Well, I draw a distinction between, I can't remember all the people you mentioned, but you mentioned Vitalik and you mentioned Elon. And I would say that Vitalik is clearly a transhumanist. And Elon, I would say, is not. Who else did you mention? Altman. Who knows what Altman's views are on transhumanism, but I haven't heard him say Vitalik, for example, has said we should eliminate female pregnancy because it's oppressive to women, and we should have artificial wombs. So I would say that's kind of a quintessentially transhumanist position, and Teilhard would find that repugnant. Teilhard's very emphatically about the complementarity of the sexes is an embodiment of this higher order of the Trinity that God has created for us. But if you look at Musk and Altman, you have this interesting development of sort of Silicon Valley religion, where Musk, in his most recent appearance on the Lex Fridman podcast, Musk for a long time has been emphatically a proponent of the simulation hypothesis and has said the odds are billions to one that our universe exists within a computer substrate. It was created by these programmers that transcend the universe. In this Lex Fridman podcast interview, this was the first time I've heard Musk actually use the word God to refer to the simulators or the simulator of the universe. He says the God of Spinoza, but he says God. So he sees some parallels there. And certainly the simulation hypothesis, while I think very important for Christians and Christian apologists to engage with, is not Christian theology at all. But it is nonetheless very interesting that the atheists who affirm it are rejecting a lot of the traditional kind of Bertrand Russell-esque premises of atheism, and they are moving towards a version of theism. I think there's no doubt about that. And so just like in Roman antiquity, when you saw kind of Roman polytheists affirming these sort of proto-Christian, cults of Sol Invictus, for example, or Stoic monotheism, just like that was an opportunity for Christian evangelism. I think this current development among people like Musk, maybe to a lesser extent Altman, I don't know as much about his views. I've heard him talk about the simulation hypothesis as well, but I think Teilhard is is a figure that provides us a helpful framework for engaging with those sorts of people and having fruitful evangelistic conversations with them, to kind of recognize the insights there about technology and human agency that are legitimate, and then talk about how they point to God and point to Christian theology. And I'll give you one specific historical example of this actually playing itself out. The physicist Frank Tipler was a sort of secularizer of the omega point in the early 1990s. Frank Tipler wrote books, in one book in particular, The Physics of Immortality, saying, I like this idea of the omega point, but I want to discard Teilhard's Christian framework. Let me just develop a purely secular mathematical model of the omega point and get rid of the Christian stuff. That was kind of the theme of this book in the early 90s. But through this kind of process of trying to develop this secular version of the omega point, Frank Tipler engaged with people like the conservative Lutheran theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg. He was, of course, engaged with Chardin. And eventually, Frank Tipler just became a Christian. And today, he's a Christian physicalist, which is kind of a controversial position, but he affirms all of the historic cardinal doctrines of the Christian faith, all the historic church councils. He's a Trinitarian. Christian physicalism is weird, but it's I think within the mainstream, most conservative Christian theologians who think seriously about it, I think, would agree. So for Tipler, Chardin served as this gateway drug to an Orthodox Christianity. And I think that can happen with other people as well, if we engage with the insights that people like Chardin offer, while at the same time definitely being aware of and being cautious of some of the serious theological problems that we do find in Teilhard.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting perspective. Like, maybe we just haven't seen the full fruits of what Teilhard started, right?
Well, we haven't used them, right? The phenomenon we see of, the simulation hypothesis in Elon Musk is the most obvious example, but there's definitely a broader current of today people that are using naturalistic and atheistic sounding premises to arrive at some version of theism. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how can Christians fruitfully engage with that and recognize that there are truths that these people are arriving at, while also responding to the areas where they're in error. And I think Teilhard is kind of a good guide or starting point for having that conversation.
I think it's good. And then, the Silicon Valley religion, I think you can also see figures, Jack Dorsey always comes to mind for me, where, I don't know his philosophy or his religion in general, but he would take these like insanely like monastic retreats, and not like at a monastery, right? But he had this, routine of very much giving up all of this technology, no contact, complete silence, in the middle of nowhere. Like they're these practices are good. And I've seen a lot of people, kind of come back to these types of, mortification practices and, we're growing in, we need to grow in virtue through these types of things. And that is getting us to a better life, which, is really how, the Greeks ultimately became Christian, right? And they focused on the virtues. So, but no, I agree with you. I think the simulation hypothesis is very clear, right? You believe that there is this universe was created by some higher being that is much more intelligent, that we could have, almost no relation to, because, there's such a vast difference in being, right? So, and anyway, like they're very, like you're saying, they're very close to, Christian theology.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you've got, Elon Musk now talking about God. The God of Spinoza is the simulators. God reveals himself through physics. You have even, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's like the epitome of the smug atheists, and not only affirming the simulation hypothesis, but even saying that the fact that our world's history seems like such a dramatic story, that is evidence of the simulation hypothesis. I mean, that's a natural theology. That's a flat out theistic argument right there. And then you've got like Grimes following these, odd, like, Christian Anon Twitter accounts and making NFTs with like crucifixes in them and stuff. And there's definitely a convergence there that Christians, I think, rightly see the danger in. And I'm not discounting the danger, but I think Christians have failed to see the opportunities in that convergence. And so I definitely think we need to think more systematically about what those opportunities are and how to exploit them.
Yep, and definitely, and really, as you mentioned, I think this Frank Tipler case is a great example, right? If we can, be like Teilhard to the pantheists, to the transhumanists, to the simulation theorists, to whoever, right? If we can come up with a very good argument against it, then, they have to either try to face our argument, or ultimately I think a lot of the culture is going in a way of rejecting reason in general, right? But as long as they don't do that, then they have to confront it. They have to say, okay, why is Teilhard wrong, or why is Ian Huyett wrong?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the model obviously is Paul in Acts, Paul quoting Stoic poets. In him we live and move and have our being is a quote from a Stoic poet. And Paul is not obviously telling Christians to affirm everything that Epictetus taught or that Marcus Aurelius taught, but he's saying these insights are true, and let me tell you how Christianity explains most fully those insights.
Yeah, and then besides just converting, the non-Christians, we also have to like convert the Christians though to actually do this, right? Yeah. So that's another big aspect of this whole conversation. Because if we don't, right, then who is building AI? Who is building crypto? Well, it's not us.
Right. Well, you've got the two buckets of eschatology I was talking about earlier. I mean, you can call it dispensationalism or you can call it something else, but the bucket of eschatology of retreat and sit back and watch the world decay. God will unilaterally do everything while we just meekly watch and pray. We have no actual role, no agency. I mean, that's not only is that a problem that has to be fixed, and not only is that a problem that has to be fixed for like Teilhardian scientific reasons, that's a problem that has to be fixed for like urgent cultural and political reasons. I mean, that's at the root of a lot of losses across the board for Christians in politics and in the culture. So, I mean, in a sense, science and technology is almost the least of our problems in terms of fixing eschatology within the church. But if we do fix it, if Christians kind of reclaim a more active eschatology that emphasizes the agency of Christians in the church, the good news is that can fix a broad swath of problems, political, cultural, scientific.
And maybe to frame it in a different way, not to just think about the heat death of the universe, right? But even in, 5 billion years, the sun is going to become a red giant and, consume the earth, right? And so, we have to, at some point in the next 5 billion years, as Christians, say, hey, how are we going to protect ourselves against this, right? There is an inevitable thing that's going to destroy the earth, right? I mean, if you subscribe to climate scientists of today, maybe that time scale is even shorter, right? But I don't know. I'm a physics guy, right? So I like the cosmology of the sun consuming the earth. But is the church going to survive by us building a spaceship and going somewhere else, or is it gonna die? If Christ doesn't return in the next 5 billion years, which I suppose is a lot of other eschatology buckets we could throw in there.
Well, that's a really good point. Teilhard has this great quote about secular people today are searching for a God that is proportionate to the dimensions of the universe that we've discovered. We have now such rich awareness of the scope and vastness of the universe. And a full account of Christianity and the way that Christianity makes sense of the universe and our role within the universe has to take account of the scale of the universe that we've discovered through the book of nature. And I think Teilhard is right to strongly emphasize that in his theology. And it certainly makes no sense in light of what we know about the size of the universe for Christians, as they often do, to just sort of hand wave that away and say, pay no attention to that. I don't really have to think about the universe and the cosmos in my theology. I'm just going to focus on the planet Earth, and that's it. And Teilhard emphasizes that biblical theology is cosmic in scope. There's a lot of cosmic language in whether it's Psalm 8 talking about the stars as part of God's creation and then saying God has put all creation under our dominion, given us dominion over all the works of his hands. Whether it's, Paul in Romans saying that creation itself, the cosmos, the universe will be set free from its bondage to corruption. There's a lot of cosmic scale language in the Bible. So it's actually not reasonable to just cabin the story of Christianity and Christian theology and eschatology to just the planet Earth and hand wave away the rest of the cosmos. So I think Teilhard is certainly right to say, as an initial matter, we need to think of a theological picture that incorporates the fullness of the universe, whatever that might be.
If there's anything I want to leave Christians with, anybody listening to the podcast, you have to recognize that technological advancement is going to happen, and it's either going to be led by people who are not converted Christians, or it's going to be led or participated in at the very least. Christians will participate in it, right? So it's either one or it's the other. So if we don't participate, I don't think you can expect that things are going to get better, or at the very least that it's going to end up in a place that is aligned with the common, what we would view as the moral good from a Christian perspective. So I think Christians need to engage with these things. And even if you're like me and you're like maybe distrustful of evolution, I thought it was interesting. The very first article, you had to say the holiness of evolution, Ian. So I have to send that to all my friends and say, hey, I really think you guys need to read this. I don't agree with everything Ian says in this article, but I think there's some really important things to be mined in it. And I think that's the mindset that Christians kind of need to be approaching this stuff with, is that, hey, I don't necessarily, and even the Catholic Church didn't necessarily agree with everything Teilhard was saying or everything any Christian is saying, but like we do have to recognize that there's things to be mined here, and we can't just be sitting back and hoping that God's going to do the work. Like we do have to participate. So I think that's really, I guess, the message that I want to be spreading.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Always happy to talk about evolution anytime. But on the standpoint about optimism about technology and the dangers of technology, the existential threat of AI, for example, that this is maybe a good note to end on, that Teilhard was very alive to those problems, to existential threats posed by technology. And, in a sense, it can be easy to misread Teilhard as this naive optimist that everything will work out for the best, when really he is an alarmist about technology. He's an apocalyptic alarmist. At the same time, he's urging us to be very involved in science and technology. He also says that as technology gives human beings greater and greater power, evil will go on growing alongside good. So good is going to gain greater and greater power, but simultaneously so will evil. So it's not this kind of common linear post-millennialism that everything just gets better and better and better. It is rather apocalyptic conflict, but precisely because it is apocalyptic conflict, we need to be actively engaged in that conflict as agents, and not to just sit it out and expect everything to work out for the best. The dangers posed by something like AI or other technologies that pose existential risks, that's all the more reason, Teilhard would say, that we need to be actively engaged with these technologies.
Yeah, exactly. I guess, yeah, it's so just because it's apocalyptic, that's why we have to be participating. So I think that's a perfect mindset. Like I see all the problems that, my dispensationalist brothers and sisters in Christ, see with these kind of technologies that are just going to give rise to the Antichrist and globalism and whatnot. Like I recognize all of that in AI and in crypto. So I'm in that space because I think it's so dangerous. And that's what I think all Christians ought to be, doing. Like we have to recognize that we have to be here. We can't just sit back. Matt, what do you think?
No, I think that's great. I think it's great. We should be in the mission field is technological. It is not geographical.
Okay. All right, well, let's wrap it up. I appreciate everybody listening to the episode, and you can find Ian. Ian, why don't you give us a little bit about where people can find you on Twitter, where they be able to read your writings? I know you said you're going to be having something come out in what was it, Catholic World Report?
I have something set to come out in Catholic World Report. If that happens, I will post it on my Twitter, twitter.com/Ian Huyett. That's Huyett. You can find me at ianhuyett.substack.com, or you can find my writing on Staseos. That's where this series was originally posted, staseos.net.
Excellent. Everybody go follow Ian and go ahead and click like on the video. Give us a comment if you have anything to say about the episode. Subscribe. We're going to be talking to a lot more Christian technologists in the crypto, in the AI, and just in general, the technology space. So hope to see you all next episode.